In what I think is one of the greatest musicals of all time, Bye Bye Birdie, Paul Lynde sings the song, "Kids, what's the matter with all these kids today?" Well, mostly what's the matter with all these kids today is parents. In Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 9, it says, that which has been is that which will be, and that which has been done is that which will be done. So there's nothing new under the sun. Parents have been a primary problem with kids since the book of Genesis. There we see two stories of parents who preferred one child over the other or over others, and the tragic results of doing so. So today I want to talk to you about when parents favor children. As was the case last week with biblical marriage, we're not going to look at somebody who gets it right that we are supposed to mimic. We're going to see somebody who got it wrong that we're supposed to avoid doing what they did. I want to first talk about the problem, and then I'll come to the stories at the end of the message. So let's get in the outline. Number one, your child needs to know that there is a God and they're not him. Your child needs to know that there is a God and they're not him. A familiar phrase that you probably have heard of is helicopter parents. These are parents whose lives revolve around, hover over their children. They overindulge their children. The child gets everything he or she wants. The codependent parent gets their happiness from the child's happiness. So if the child's unhappy, I'm unhappy, and if they're happy, I'm happy, so I live to make them happy so I can be happy. The child grows up thinking that the world revolves around him or her and exists to make them happy. The problem is they grow up and become adults. And they go into a world that doesn't revolve around them and that surely does not exist to make them happy. Those children are going to leave home if they launch and find out that the world doesn't revolve around them and that they often, more often than not, don't get their way as adults. You've heard me say that your job is not to make your child happy. Your job is to teach your child how to be happy. Have you noticed that life has a way of bursting our bubbles? It has a way of crashing our dreams. Your child will not get their way someday a lot. So you have to teach your child the skill of being okay when life is not the way they want it to be, not the way they expected it to be. As I so often say, most of life is making the best of what you wished wasn't. In this life, there's nothing perfect. There's no perfect pastor. There's no perfect church. There's no perfect marriage because there's no perfect man and woman to be in that marriage. There are no perfect kids, no perfect grandkids. There's no perfect job. There's no perfect house. There's no perfect anything. And so all of life, we're dealing with less than what we wished was. And by the way, one of the arguments for the existence of God is that we long for perfect. Don't we all want things to be perfect? Well, evolution has no answer for that. But if perfect exists, and it does in a person God, and it does in a place heaven, and God made man, the Bible says that he put eternity in man's heart, so we long for perfect. But sadly, nothing is. There's an epidemic in America of people who are unable to cope. They go to pieces when things don't go their way. Most people who become drug addicts and alcoholics do so because they're medicating their inability to cope. Life is not the way they wished it was, and they can't take it. They don't have the skills to deal with it. So suicides have become increased significantly, and we've raised more and more kids who just can't cope. Your child needs to know that there is a God and that he or she isn't him. The world does not revolve around them. It revolves around him. The world does not exist to make them happy. The world exists to bring glory to God. Now, I have two things under that. Number one, Your life should be lived for the Lord, not for them. Your life should be lived for the Lord, not for them. Listen closely. You weren't made for them. You were made for Him. And they weren't made for you. They were made for Him. Created by Him and for Him. You're to live your life to please the Lord, not just to make your child happy. You're to live to please Him. You don't live for your child, you live for the Lord. Look at 2 Corinthians 5:15. He died for all so that they who live may no longer live for themselves, but for Him. Jesus didn't die for you to give you a ticket to heaven. He died for you so you'd no longer live for yourself, but you would live for Him. You'd live the life He made you for, not the life you thought you wanted. And number two under that, their life should be lived for the Lord and not for themselves. Their life should be lived for the Lord and not for themselves. Like you, your child needs to learn to live for something besides themselves, to live for God. They live for more than what they want to do and what they wished was. They should live for the Lord. They were made for Him. Colossians 1:16, all things have been created for Him. Now listen closely. In America, in Christian homes, the greatest idol, in my opinion, is children. It's parents who don't make nearly enough about God and make way too much about their kids. If you're existing to keep your children happy, you're not keeping your Lord happy. You're just not. Now, do we want our kids to be unhappy? Well, of course we don't. But there's something more important than their happiness in this world. You need to know that, and they better figure that out, or they'll be addicted or dead. Your child should not grow up under the impression that everyone and everything exists for their happiness. They're going to live in a world where people didn't get the memo. Your child needs to know there's a God, and that God is not Him. Here's number two. Your job as a parent is not for them to think that you're great, but for others to think that they're great. It's not for them to think that you're great, it's for others to think that they're great. Parents who need their children's approval, cannot lead their children. The day you have to have your child's approval is the day you're no longer in charge of that house. And now the children are raising the parents. Why? Because the parents are more afraid of the children than the children are of the parents. I heard something really funny this week. This is really good. This person said that if you love and feed your dog, he will think that you're God. How many of you have a dog? Isn't that true? I mean, they just think you're the greatest thing that ever was. You just love and feed your dog. Now, this guy also said, if you love and feed your cat, he'll think he's God. I don't make this stuff up. I just report it, okay? That's really true. I've had cats. That's really true. Now, I'm going to kind of make an analogy of it. Dogs have owners, cats have staff. If you're overly good and generous to your spouse, unless there's some other real problem, he or she will be grateful for you and love you for it. If you're overly good to your children, they will fall in love with themselves. Did you get that? This is really important. If you're it's that idea of spoiling. Unless you got a messed up spouse, you can spoil your spouse all day long. It's a good thing. They'll be grateful and love you for it. But when you start spoiling your kids, you start ruining your kids. You say, well, I don't spoil them. I just give them everything they want. There's a huge difference between raising children and raising adults. To raise children who think that you're great Give them everything they want and let them do everything they want to do. They'll think you're the greatest mom or dad ever lived. But you won't raise an adult. You'll raise a problem. And you'll pay for that problem throughout their adulthood and throughout the rest of your life. If you want to raise an adult who other people think is great, then don't give them everything, even if you can afford it, especially if you can afford it. Teach them to be happy when things aren't as they wish they were. Now, I'm not a big Shaquille O'Neal fan at all, but I read this. His son wanted something, and of course, Shaquille O'Neal is maybe a billionaire, probably is. He's filthy rich, and his son wanted something, and Shaq wasn't going to get it for him. He said, "But Dad, we're rich." And Shaq said to him, "We're not rich, I'm rich." And that's what some of you need to tell your kids. You may not be rich, but you say, "Well, we got money. We got the money." No, we don't have the money. I got the money. You don't have any money. That sounds like Shaq's trying to raise an adult. Imagine how you can destroy a child with that kind of money. Track the children of athletes and politicians in many cases, and especially movie stars. It's just tragedy after tragedy after tragedy in most cases. So your goal isn't for your kids to think you're the greatest. Your goal is for them to leave your home and everybody that ever meets them thinks they're the greatest. Can I tell you something? If everybody thinks they're the greatest, you're pretty great. But if your kid's a problem who can't keep a job, can't stay in a marriage, can't function, has to medicate themselves with alcohol or drugs or something to cope, you ain't that great. Listen closely. Loving somebody is caring more about them than you do yourself. It's caring more about their good than your good. Loving your child means I would rather you dislike me but be successful and everybody else love you than for you to love me and think I'm great and you be a failure and be a problem the rest of your life to everybody around you. Wow, that really cuts through the mustard, doesn't it? See, when I want my kids to love me, I'm loving me. I need them to love me. How many of your kids ever told you they hate you? Okay, the rest of you have never been parents. Okay? You probably haven't. I hate you. Well, I love you. That's why you can't do that. That's why you can't have that. I'm a grandfather, a doodah. When I played tennis, and I had the ability to really dial in and play really, really good, and I can completely dial out. So I'm dialed out, and I'm trying to dial back in. I'll say to myself, athletes talk to themselves, I'll say, "I am doodah, hear me roar." Okay, that's how I try to get back in. Doesn't always work, but I try it. Anyway, I have 4 grandkids whom I adore. I don't know how many times from the beginning of the first one, people said, "Oh, it's great being a grandparent. You can just spoil them and send them home." Betsy and I, the last thing on earth we want is spoiled brat grandkids. It has never been our aspiration to spoil our kids. Our goal isn't that they think we're the greatest. Our goal is for them to become the greatest. And so we deal with our grandkids just like we did with our own kids. Kids don't become great by getting any and everything they want. Look at 1 Corinthians 6:19-20. You're not your own. You've been bought with a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body. You're to raise your kids to know the Lord and to glorify Him. And if they're going to glorify Him, the world is not going to revolve around them. It just isn't. It's time to raise my kids to bring glory to God. Your job is not for them to think you're the greatest, it's for everybody else to think they're the greatest. And so you just get report after report. I met your daughter. This happens to me all the time. I met your daughter. Gosh, she was such a wonderful person. Ding, ding, ding. Number 3, your child needs instruction and discipline. Your child needs instruction and discipline. Bring them up, Ephesians 6:4, bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. 2 things under that. Number 1, you are to teach them what to do. You're to teach them what to do. I tried to make athletes out of both my daughters. Neither one of them were. And anyway, so I eventually had to just realize they're not like me, okay? They're more like their mother. And they all can do things, but they just didn't want to play sports. But I realized I had to teach them every single thing. If you're a coach up here teaching upward, I mean, you got to teach them every single thing. They've got to be taught about life, about hygiene, about manners, about morals, about where your hands and feet go, what you're not supposed to put in your mouth, priorities, everything else. They got to be taught. And your children primarily belong to God, not you. Frankly, we're all a bunch of nannies. They're God's children, but He's given us this responsibility to raise them. You are most importantly, therefore, to teach them about Him, about His will, about His ways. So when you do this, we do it all the time. Deuteronomy 6:7. There in your outline. You shall teach them my commandments diligently, teach my commandments diligently to them, to your sons, and you shall talk of them when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way and when you lie down and when you rise up. In other words, you're always teaching. Something in the news. You're watching something in the news that's good. You teach from it. You're watching something in the news that's bad. You teach from it. You see somebody who is successful, doing well, you teach from it. You see somebody who's failing, going to jail, you teach from it. You're constantly looking for illustrations to teach truth. So you're to teach them. Number 2, you're to ensure that they do it. You teach them what to do, and then you're to ensure that they do it. We're to instruct and to discipline. Listen closely. If you don't discipline your children well early and gain their respect/fear, you'll never get them under control. And you'll pay for it, and they'll pay for it their entire lives in most cases. You got to do it early. But I don't want my children to fear me. How many of you feared your dads especially? Come on. How many of you who feared your dads loved your dads? Right. God says we're to fear Him. Is He not a good father? If we're supposed to fear God and He's a good father, I suggest if your kid doesn't fear you, you're not a good father. See, what we got in America while we have kids out of control is we got parents who are afraid of what their children might do. Your children need to be afraid of what you might do. We got it all the way backwards. And so we got kids out of control. We got snowflakes all over our college campuses. God's a father. We're supposed to fear Him, have a fearful respect for Him. If you don't fear Him, you should, because one day you're going to stand before Him and you're going to be rewarded or punished eternally. Look at Hebrews 12, 6, 8, 10, and 11. Whom the Lord loves, He disciplines. He disciplines, He corrects. Verse 8, if you're without discipline, correction, of which all have become partakers, then you're illegitimate children and not sons. Now, I don't know how many times I've been in a mall somewhere and or a grocery store and I've seen some kid out of control, some small kid. They're pitching what we used to call a hissy fit. They do the collapso. You've seen kids do the collapso? Somehow they fall to the ground and they triple their body weight. And you try to pick them up and they just go down and go down. Or they scream or they cry. What they're doing is punishing you. What they're doing is establishing who's in charge in this relationship. And what you need to do, you've heard it said, somebody put this on the internet, somebody went off on it. If you're going to cry, if you don't have a good reason to cry and you want to cry, I'll give you a reason to cry. And then your children wail. How many of you had kids who wailed? They just cried. I'd say, you're welcome to go to your bedroom and cry. But if I hear you crying outside that door, I'll come in and give you something to cry about. See, I was raising adults. I wasn't raising kids. It's a whole different set of skills. I was trying to raise decent people who go out and succeed in the world. Not kids who are dysfunctional and love me because I was too. Which is what that would have been otherwise. Verse 10, he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. All discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful, but sorrowful. Well, that's kind of didn't need to be stated, did it? Yet to those who have been trained by it, afterwards it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. Righteousness goes a long way in the world. Unrighteousness doesn't. Your children need to understand that when they do the wrong thing or don't do the right thing, they experience undesirable consequences. When they're small, as they get older, it changes how you do this. When they're small, they don't understand why they can't touch the socket, but they know that every time they try to, their bottom gets hot. That was weak. I may be in the wrong room. They can understand their bottom gets hot. Their bottom gets hot enough times. They don't know why they can't touch it, but they won't. I know of a kid who the parents would tell his kid what to do, and the kid would never obey him. He'd just run, come here, Johnny. He'd run away. True story. And eventually, one day, he's out in his front yard, they lived in the city, and they said, come here, Johnny, come here, Johnny. Johnny ran the other way right in front of a car and it killed him. The parents should have told Johnny a long time ago, if I tell you what to do and you do something else, your bottom gets real hot. Real hot. So you may not understand what I'm telling you to do, but you do understand you should be smart enough to figure out this pain avoidance thing. I may be at the wrong church this morning. This is how life works. You do the right thing, good things happen. Do the wrong thing, bad things happen. It's how it ought to work in your home if you're trying to raise healthy children, adults who can cope. When our kids were young, I'd come home from church and from work, and I'd come to the door, Betsy come to the door crying. She said, all I do is beat them all day long. They're gonna hate me. They adore her. They adore her. Whom the Lord loves, he disciplines. I was talking about the kids pitching the fits in the mall. I've thought often, I thought, you know what, if I could adopt you for about 10 minutes, I could fix that. But I don't correct other people's children because they're not mine. If you can sin and don't get corrected, you're not God's. If you're sinning and you're a believer, you know it's coming, and it's coming. And if God disciplines those he loves, it's the right thing to do. And if you don't discipline those you love, you're not doing the right thing. This is what you're to do. Teach them how to behave. So this is what you say to your kids. This is what you're to do. This is how you're to behave. It's my job to make sure you do it. If children don't, listen closely, if children don't respect and fear their parents, they won't respect or fear anyone or anything. And that explains where we are today with kids in society. They don't respect anyone or anything. So give me some examples. BLM riots, where people destroy buildings and break into businesses and steal. This on campus now, anti-everything that's ever been considered right. That's what's going on campuses. Everything that's ever been considered right, including Israel and America, is now wrong. Everything that's ever been right is now wrong. They have no respect for anybody. They're giving their parents the bird. What about these mob flash robberies that are going on? where it's organized. They show up and they break into Nordstrom's or all these other places. You got San Francisco, you got all these big companies coming out there. They're just not going to deal with it anymore. No respect for anyone or anything. Children who are raised by wimpy fathers or no fathers at all usually end up fearing nobody and respecting nothing. And so if they get pulled over by a policeman, they're liable to pick a fight with him. They don't have the sense to know that's not a good idea. A lot of people have been shot in police altercations, being arrested. Far more white people than black people. Far more. That doesn't make the news because it doesn't fit the agenda. But far more. But here's the deal. It would almost never happen, probably never happen, if people didn't resist arrest. Correct? So somebody would have taught that kid how to behave, he'd be alive today. And our cities wouldn't be burned down and a whole lot of other things. This is a big part of why teaching school has become so difficult. Probably it's easier in elementary, but you get up in middle and high school and you realize you got a bunch of kids who don't fear the teacher, they don't fear the principal, they don't fear the school system, they don't fear anybody because they don't fear their mom and dad. And they're a problem. And you got to wave some magic wand and teach them and get them A's. Good luck with that. Your child needs instruction and they need discipline. Number 4, rewarding your children for how they behave is biblical. We're talking about not favoring children. When you reward your child for how they behave, that's not favoring a child. That's doing what's actually biblical. They need to know that when they do what they ought to do, behave as they ought to behave, good things come. Galatians 6:7, whatever a man sows, this he will reap. 1 Timothy 5:18, the laborer is worthy of his wages. Circle the word his. Don't miss it. He's worthy of his wages. He ought to get what he deserves. Somebody else shouldn't get what he deserves. They don't deserve it. And he shouldn't get what somebody else deserves because that's not what he deserves. He ought to get what he deserves. That's biblical. In Psalm 19:11 says, by your command your servant is warned, and keeping them there's great reward. That ought to be true in your household. In 2 Corinthians 5:10 says, we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ so that each one may be recompensed for his deeds in the body according to what he has done, whether good or bad. You got a kid who grows up thinking he can do anything, get away with it. One day he's going to stand before a holy, righteous God and where he can't get away with nothing. And he's in trouble. Kids, what's the matter with all these kids today? Parents, asleep at the wheel. I'm just going to go to meddling, okay? Letting screens raise their kids because they're tired and distracted. If you think a few hours at church or a church camp or a retreat is going to undo 7 or 8 hours a day on a smartphone, you're a fool. You ought to have absolute control over that. Our children never watch TV unless we knew exactly what they were watching. And you can't let them watch Disney now because they got all kinds of LGBTQ plus stuff in Disney. Christians need to do something to affect their society as much as the Bud Light drinkers. But I'm not sure we're going to. Obedience to God produces rewards. Your child's obedience to you should result in rewards. Disobedience with God to God results in discipline, problems, pain. Your child's disobedience should result in discipline, problems, pain. This is how God's kingdom works. It's how the world works. It's how your home should work. If not, you raise children who are in for a real shock someday. Rewarding your children differently for how they behave is not favoring or showing preference to one for no reason, which brings us to number 5. Indiscriminately favoring one child over another is destructive. Indiscriminately favoring one child over another is destructive. Now we've kind of changed gears here a little. Up till now, we've been talking about indulging our kids, our lives being too much about them, our codependency upon them for them to be happy. And of course, again, we all want our kids to be happy, but what you want to do is teach them about be happy for a lifetime, not make them happy in the moment. If you're always making them happy in the moment, they won't be happy for a lifetime. Indiscriminately means in a random manner. In our case, it means preferring one child over another for no good reason, just that you just do. There are at least 4 ways that favoring one child over another is a bad idea. Number 1, it's bad for the family. This will be real clear in our stories today. Number 2, it's bad for the child. It turns them into entitled, self-centered people. Number 3, it's bad for the siblings. We'll see that. It causes them to compete for attention and to resent the child who's favored, if they're not the favored one, and they probably going to resent you for favoring the favored one. They feel cheated. It says in Ephesians 6:4 goes on to say, do not provoke your children to anger. Well, one way you can do that is by showing favoritism. Number 4, it's bad for society. A favored child thinks he or she can do anything they want and can have anything they want and do anything they want to do. They think that the rules, whatever they are, don't apply to them. They think they can act as they please and get any result they want. Why do they think that? Because it's what they've learned. They can misbehave and have a Merry Christmas. They can wear you out, break every rule you have, and get buried in stuff on their birthdays. They think they can act as they please, get any result they want. They become their own worst enemy in life. Look at Proverbs 29:15. A child who gets his own way brings shame to his mother. If you love your child, then it's as or more important for others to love them as it is for them to love you. Let's get to the stories. Number 6, Isaac and Rebekah favored different children. They favored different children. Turn to Genesis chapter 25, verses 21 to 34. I'm not going to read the passage, but you might want to look there as I talk through it. Genesis 25, 21, 34. So Rebekah is pregnant with twins. She gives birth. Esau, the oldest, comes out. He's a hairy man who loves to hunt. He's impulsive, he's reckless, and he's given to exaggeration. Esau sold his birthright for some stew, thinking that he would just die if he didn't get something to eat right now. The text says that in doing so, he despised his birthright. Jacob is the youngest of the twins. He's smooth-skinned and apparently loved to cook. He was conniving and calculating. In Genesis chapter 25, verse 28, we learn that Isaac loved Esau because he loved to eat what Esau would hunt and kill. Rebekah, it says, loved Jacob. There's no reason given why. Maybe it was because Jacob loved to cook with her. Maybe it was because she resented Isaac favoring Esau. Maybe it was to get back at Isaac for having to lie about being his sister and what could have happened to her. But whatever reason, she loved Jacob. She got a mama's boy and a daddy's boy. Sibling rival, at least among brothers, seems to be a normal result of sin and the curse. The first sibling rivalry, which took place in the first family, the firstborn, Cain, hated and killed the secondborn, Abel. In Genesis 25, 29 to 34, Esau comes in from hunting. He's really hungry. Jacob's made some stew. Esau wants some of it. Jacob seizes the opportunity, tells Esau that he'll give him some stew if Esau will give to him his birthright, which entitled him to a greater inheritance, much greater inheritance. Esau exaggerated. He was going to die if he didn't get to eat something immediately, so he gave up his birthright. Esau was the kind of guy who cared more about right now than he did the future. Isaac favored Esau. Rebekah favored Jacob. If you're keeping score, and I'm pretty sure they were, the score is now Rebekah 1, Isaac 0. In Genesis chapter 27, 1-36, Isaac is old, he's nearly blind, and nearing death. So he tells Esau, his firstborn, to go and prepare his favorite game dinner so he can eat it and give his blessing to Esau. I saw something I've never noticed in this passage. As many times I've read this, I don't know how many times it's been a lot. I never saw this. I always assumed that Jacob came up with the idea to deceive his dad and that Rebekah helped him do it. If you look at verses 5-10, it was Rebekah's idea. It was her idea to deceive her own husband to steal this blessing for her favored child. She's also the one that figured out how they would do it. Jacob said, how can we do this? He's hairy, I'm not. So what they did is they went and got Esau's clothes. They got goat skins and put them on Jacob's hands and his neck in case Isaac felt of him. Now, goat skins, think about this. He must have been one hairy dude. Anyway, that's another story for another day. So Isaac thinks it's Jacob, though, because of his voice. But he rubs the back of his hands, feels the goat skins, assumes it's Esau, and gives Jacob his blessing. If you're keeping score, Rebekah 2, Isaac 0. And this is the kind of home where they kept score. The parents weren't a team. Parents, do not let your children play you against each other. Some of you have kids who will try to do that. You are the team. They are the enemy. Okay? Write that down somewhere. You are the team. They are the enemy. Because what they'll do is they'll make you part of their team and make your spouse the enemy. And you'll make your spouse the enemy. Then all kinds of bad things happen. So Isaac favored Esau and Rebekah favored Jacob. Number 7, Jacob favored Joseph. When Esau discovered what Jacob had done, he made plans to kill his brother. So Rebekah found out about it, sent Jacob away to her brother's house, where he ended up marrying 2 sisters and having 12 boys and 1 daughter at least by those 2 women and their 2 maids who became surrogates. More on that mess in a message to come. In Genesis 37, 1-36, the text tells us that Jacob loved Joseph more than his other sons. Now, if you were reading the Bible and you got to that point, you'd go, uh-oh, something bad's about to happen. This is not good. Isn't going to end well. He gave Joseph something that he didn't give his other sons, a special coat. What should be no surprise, Joseph's 10 older brothers hated him because of the favoritism. The 10 brothers who didn't share the same mother later eventually conspired to kill Joseph. They instead sold him as a slave, thinking, well, we can make a shekel on him. So they sold him as a slave. They got his coat, they shredded it, and they killed an animal, put animal's blood on it, and they brought it to Jacob. Is this Joseph's coat? Well, Jacob didn't have access to a lab, to science, or DNA, so he assumed it was. His heart was broken for years. The offending brothers had just ridded themselves of Joseph, of whom they were jealous, and they brought enormous grief upon their dad for showing the favoritism. You'll hear more about that later. Showing favoritism is a bad idea. It'll breed hate between your children and likely resentment towards you. Unless it's a case of a child earning a privilege or reward for good behavior, or losing a privilege or reward, being disciplined for bad behavior. All these are biblical. You have to treat your children the same way. What you do for child A, you got to do it for child B. What you give to child A at the appropriate time, you got to give to child B. If not, you put your kids at odds with each other, you put them at odds with you. And it's possible you'll drive a wedge between you and your spouse, and now the two of you are keeping score. Does God love us? Answer. Outrageously. Outrageously. Would send his own son to hell to have us? To say he loves us is not enough. He outrageously loves us. So he loves us. Does God give us everything we want? No, he does not. Could God give us everything we want? Yeah. But he's interested in maturity. He's interested in making us like himself, because becoming like himself gives us joy and a happiness that'll last a lifetime into eternity, where we don't have to have everything go our way to have that joy and happiness. God's got a bigger plan. He's got a longer view. Character will serve your child well long after the permissiveness and the stuff are gone. You ought to write that down. Character will serve your child well long after the permissiveness, let them do everything they want, and the stuff you give them are gone. God deals with us fairly. Each of us can know him. Each of us can experience an abundant life. I can't have your life and you can't have mine, but we can both enjoy ours. Wanting somebody else's life is a bad idea. For one, you can't have it. And two, God's given you a life. It's not the life they have. It's a different life, but it's a life you can really enjoy if you'll quit wanting theirs. So treat your children the same. Teach them life's first and most important lesson. It's the first thing God taught Adam and Eve. If you do the right thing, good things happen. Do the wrong thing, bad things happen. In their case, they found out that the bad things were far worse than they thought they'd ever be. One last fascinating thing from both these stories. Psalm 76:10 says of God that the wrath of man shall praise you. The wrath of man shall praise you. So God can take the wrong things that men do and weave them into and use them to accomplish his purpose. Now this is incredible. If you're not a Christian, you ought to be one just for what I'm about to tell you. God can take bad things that people knowingly did the wrong thing, and he can weave them into and use them to accomplish his purposes. So in Genesis 25, verse 23, God told Rebekah that before these kids were born, that the oldest would serve the youngest. That Esau was going to serve Jacob. So Jacob ends up conniving and conspiring to steal the birthright, to rob the blessing, but he was supposed to get it. So God takes the wrong that they did and accomplishes what he had in mind to begin with. That's amazing. He uses the wrong behavior of Jacob and Rebekah to accomplish his purpose. Jacob would become Israel, and the tribes would be his children and grandchildren. And Esau would become Edom, the Edomites, throughout the rest of the Old Testament. God didn't forget Joseph, even though his brothers probably tried to. So Joseph is sold into slavery. God providentially and miraculously exalts him to become the prime minister of Egypt. He later saved his family. All of Jacob's family went to Egypt. He saved them. If he saved them, he saved the Jews, because all the Jews came from that family. If he saved the Jews, he saved the Messiah, because the Messiah was a Jew who came from this family. And if he saved the Messiah, there's a sense in which Joseph saved you. There would have been no Jews, there would have been no Jesus, there would have been no salvation without Joseph. How did he get there? Because his brother sinned. And God takes the wrong and weaves it and does something incredible with it. Look at what Joseph says later when he meets his brothers and they know who he is. In Genesis 50, verse 20, he says, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about the present result to preserve many people alive." So if you're trusting the Lord, even when somebody intentionally does something bad to you, God can do something good with it. Look at Romans 8, 28, 9. God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. It doesn't say he causes all things. It says he causes all the things that happen to work together for good. It doesn't say that he does this for any and everybody. It says for those who are called according to his purpose, who are driven by living for him, is what it literally means. Why does he do this? Verse 29, "For those whom he foreknew, he predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son." So God takes the bad things that happen to us and uses it to make us like Jesus, which is the best possible outcome. The best possible outcome is not getting what you want. It's becoming who you're supposed to be. God uses the bad things in our lives to accomplish his purpose. He never wastes a hurt. He uses them to transform our character. Look at Deuteronomy 23:5. "The Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you because the Lord your God loves you." What a good, loving, awesome God.